So I'm Rich Jersich. I'm with the California Department of Water Resources. I've been actually with the department for over 20 years now, and I'm on the management team that's kind of implementing our activities with respect to SGMA, as we're calling it. And I do want to kind of highlight this quote when the governor signed this legislation. It really does focus in on the local implementation of the act. And as we're moving forward, we're really taking that to heart and trying to position ourselves within the department to support the local implementation of the act. And so, whether it's financial assistance, technical assistance, and then again with our outreach efforts, just trying to get that local perspective as we're moving forward. I'll just get into, so I want to give a little bit of kind of background on the groundwater conditions in California, some of the things that kind of led up to where we are today with this legislation, and then I'll get into more of the roles and responsibilities of the department, some of the regulations we're required to develop in our outreach efforts, and also a strategic plan we put out recently. So this is a map over here that kind of shows the different groundwater basins. It's hard to see from the back, but all the blue areas are all the alluvial basins in the state. And so that was the starting point initially for the legislation, and then the department had gone through with our CASDM program and developed this basin priorities, prioritizing the basin into high, medium, low, and very low. And so based on those priorities, the high and medium ones are the ones that are really covered by the SGMA legislation. But it's important to note that groundwater is one of our key storage reservoirs in the state, along with our snowpack and then our surface reservoirs. So these three features combined are really what helps us store water and helps us to get through the drought like the one we're going through now, more so than we could have without them. And a lot of people don't understand that really the groundwater reservoirs have a huge amount of storage capacity and to help us get through these dry periods. This is a chart that came up through our California Water Plan recently, and it just kind of highlights some of the data, and it shows the significance of groundwater again. So in this chart, so we, for the Water Plan, we kind of aggregate the state into 10 different hydrologic regions, and so this kind of aggregates data by these hydrologic regions. And these darker blue bars are the groundwater, volume of groundwater being pumped in this hydrologic region. The lighter blue bar is the total water use. So you can just kind of take a snapshot. You can see how significant groundwater is. In some cases, like in the Tulare, there's a huge volume of water being extracted from the groundwater basins to meet that water demand. And then in other places, but that's about 50% on average last 5 years, or 2005 through 2010, the average. But then you look at other areas like the Central Coast where maybe the volume isn't very high, but groundwater actually makes up over 85% of the average demand to meet the demands in that basin. So it just shows you at a snapshot kind of the significance. And overall, the state as an average is around 40% of our supply comes from groundwater during kind of normal conditions. And then in dry conditions, that can be up to 60% of our supply. So again, it just highlights how significant groundwater is for our water supply. This is just kind of the latest conditions drought monitor from the USDA from last week, actually, and it kind of gives the status of the drought in California. As water managers in California, we don't really like this because water in California has moved so far apart. We're a very heavily plumbed state, so we're moving water everywhere, and so this kind of general description of drought doesn't do a lot for us, but it does kind of give you an idea of how significant the drought is in California. And it's been like this. And if you look at, I don't have the picture showing the rest of the country, but really California is in the worst conditions with respect to the rest of the country when it comes to the drought. And that puts additional stress on our groundwater, but again, if we are able to manage our groundwater sustainably over the long term, we can get through these dry periods. I do want to spend a few minutes going over adverse impacts. We heard a lot of questions about that, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about that. And I think it's important to note that with respect to SGMA, when they're talking about sustainable groundwater management, they're not talking about going back to what it was 100 years ago. It's really, the law actually says January 1 of 2015 is kind of the starting point for the most part when you're looking at your adverse impacts. And so that's an important point to look at as we're moving forward. We're not trying to go back 100 years ago. So this is a plot that actually came out from our, and I know it's hard to read, but in November we put out a report associated with the drought and looking at the groundwater impacts associated with the drought. And as part of that report, we basically looked at all the, the department in conjunction with the local agencies. We monitored groundwater level throughout the state. And so we looked at, okay, how is groundwater changing over this drought? And try to come up with a little sense of what that looks like. And the kind of the actually pretty scary thing here is all these black dots you're seeing, those are wells where groundwater is at the lowest we've ever recorded. So however long that period for that well, sometimes it's 20 years, sometimes it's 50 years, but groundwater in these areas with these black dots is the lowest we've ever recorded. And you can see how widespread that is throughout California. It's not just the Central Valley, although a lot of the monitoring we do is in the Central Valley. But so, groundwater conditions are under stress right now. But again, this is a cyclical thing, and with we're hoping next year will be a wet year and we can start to recover from these conditions. So another thing that we're looking at is water quality. So this is actually up in the Monterey Bay area, and it just shows a progression of seawater intrusion into the coastal aquifers over time. So, starting in the 1940s all the way up into 2011 is the last date, and you can just see over time how that seawater intrusion is going further and further inland. And so this is, again, something we want to look at. We're not saying it's part of SGMA. You have to bring it back to what it was 100 years ago again, but how we manage that, and it's going to be really up to the local agencies and these groundwater sustainability agencies to define their objectives for how they're going to manage that seawater intrusion. Subsidence is another thing. So land subsidence, if you extract too much groundwater within an area, the actual land surface starts to sink. And this plot here is actually, this data is actually looking at historical land subsidence that we, until recently, thought we were actually over. So this looks from 1926 to 1970 within the San Joaquin Valley here. And you can see up here it says up to 8.5 meters, which is 27 feet of land subsidence within those areas. And for the longest time, in recent years, we thought we were kind of recovering from that. But in just the last 5 years, we've been seeing land subsidence again during this recent drought. And in some areas, up to a foot of land subsidence a year. And that has significance because you have all that infrastructure sitting up on the surface. And when your land's dropping, it can throw things out of whack. And so in terms of your canals, your flood control levees, your roads, all that stuff can be affected. So this is another important thing that we're observing, and we're trying to see what we can do to improve that situation. This is just an example, I believe, from the Delta Mendota Canal where land subsidence has caused some kind of rupturing of the canal there. And so it's just something we want to be able to address over the long term. I heard a couple of questions this morning about kind of the ecosystem impacts. And so this is an example here. This is the Cosumnes River up in the Sacramento Valley. And generally, like a lot of streams, it only has a small dam upstream. So in the summertime, it will tend to dry out, particularly in the fall period. But unfortunately, this is also a salmon stream. So when there is water in the stream, salmon will migrate up and spawn. And what we've noticed in the past, groundwater was high, and it would actually feed in a base flow into this stream. But we've noticed over recent years with continued groundwater pumping that there's less groundwater that's feeding into that stream. So the period of time where that stream ends up being dry is kind of increasing. And so that's something that we're looking at. And what happens now is the salmon are kind of sitting there at the mouth of the river where the McCalmie is, and they're waiting for those storms to come in so they can begin migrating up the stream. And so again, this would be something that the local groundwater sustainability agency would have to look at. Again, they're not required under the law to go back to what it was 100 years ago, but how can they better manage the system to improve these conditions? So there's this overall just trend that we've noticed, and it's beyond the drought. So the drought has certainly shown some significant impacts, but just trends in certain areas of the state where you have this long-term withdrawal of groundwater. There's areas where they're shifting from more of a row crop to more of a permanent crop. And a lot of time, in a lot of the areas in the Central Valley, they're actually moving from areas that were not irrigated to irrigating with groundwater these almonds and other crops like that. So significant increases in water use that we're seeing as well. Population growth, and also things are getting warmer, climate change, we've observed that. So all these things are adding to the stress, and I think it's kind of helped build that momentum with the legislature, where they decided they needed to come out with this SGMA Act to help improve the conditions. I think the bottom line is, when we get into sustainable groundwater management, is we got to get a handle on our water balance. So what are the inputs? What are the sources of supply, surface water? How much groundwater we're using? What are the different management options within the basin? And trying to wrap around that and trying to come up with a sustainable management based on those impacts, or those different factors. So as part of the state's activity, the governor came out last year, January of last year, with what he's calling the California Water Action Plan. And so that's looking at water management as a whole, trying to look at sustainable management on a broad basis. So this is looking at things, there's 10 main actions, but looking at new storage, promoting water conservation, improving flood management. Groundwater is obviously a big part of that, improving ecosystem management. So again, a large number of actions that are combined could help bring California as a whole into sustainable water management. This includes things like improving conditions in the Delta, which supplies a lot of water throughout the state. One of the actions specifically in the Water Action Plan is related to groundwater storage and improving both capacity and improving groundwater management. So this includes surface storage, includes groundwater storage, it includes remediation of groundwater, cleanup of groundwater basins. So this is a key action. And so right now, the department, we're actually reorganizing ourselves internally so we can better implement all these different actions under the action plan, because this really is the state's policy with respect to water management. And then unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the voters approved Proposition 1, which actually provides significant funding for not just groundwater and surface storage, but on all those 10 actions that I mentioned. So there is funding to support a lot of these activities. And then I just want to kind of highlight the timeline. So this SGMA legislation is just the latest in a progression. So the state has, over the last 20 or so years, been implementing these requirements progressively. So back in the early 90s, we had AB 3030, which Tony talked about, with respect to expanding the number of agencies that have authority to manage groundwater. That was followed up by SB 1938, which again expanded the role and responsibilities with respect to groundwater management. The CASGEM program, which allows agencies to submit data to the department in terms of groundwater management or groundwater levels, and then leading up to the California Water Action Plan and the SGMA legislation. So it's been a progressive series of activities leading to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So I do want to mention, just a couple weeks ago, the department came out with what we're calling our strategic plan for SGMA, and it's really outlining, again, how we're organizing ourselves to implement the act. And really it gets down to how can we best support these local agencies as they're developing their sustainability agencies. This is the timeline of the legislation. I'm not going to go into too much detail because Tony covered this very well, but just want to say the orange boxes here are the things the department is responsible for. So we're kind of fresh out of the gate. We have a lot of responsibilities, and really those responsibilities have to do with setting the framework for sustainable groundwater management, and I'll talk about the regulations that we're developing in a minute. The green boxes are the local agency requirements, so those are things like forming the GSA and then developing those sustainability plans. And then over on the kind of the lower right, those are the actions where the department will be working with the water board, and particularly the water board has responsibility with those areas that are not able to kind of meet the requirements of the act. The water board's kind of the stopgap for that. And there is an interaction where the department will be providing information based on those sustainability plans and supporting that effort as well. We have implemented a pretty significant outreach in an alignment effort within the department in terms of our strategic plan, and that's really to work with local agencies and others to hear what the different issues are as we're developing our regulations. So this kind of shows the different entities we've been meeting with actually since about October of last year. We've started meeting with the different practitioners, so the water agencies who will most likely be implementing the act is the groundwater sustainability agencies. We've been meeting with different water associations and organizations, non-governmental organizations, kind of hearing what their thoughts are in terms of their concerns with respect to the act. Right now we've been really focusing on the basin boundary regulations, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then later on we'll be talking about the sustainability plans themselves. We've been having one-on-one meetings. We've been meeting with state agencies, so we've been meeting with the State Water Board pretty regularly to hear kind of what their requirements are and what our activities are, and make sure we're on the same page. We've been meeting with California tribes, again, to hear what the different issues are there. So we've had over 30 different meetings like this throughout the state over the last several months. A number of communication efforts. I'll show the websites in the end, at the end of the presentation, outreach. I've kind of just went over through these. So this is our strategic plan. It kind of highlights 5 major areas that I'll walk through in terms of that. And the strategic plan is up on our website, and so you're able to download that and take a review. And it's under public comment right now through June 1st, so you have the ability to look at kind of what the department's thinking about in terms of our implementation of the act, and then to hear what your thoughts are in terms of how we can improve what we're proposing. So I'll just walk through each of these different areas. So the first one is developing a framework for sustainable groundwater management. And that's kind of our responsibilities right now with respect to the basin boundary regulations. And so those are really defining the law. SGMA basically says the boundaries that people should use are based on the Bulletin 118, which is California's groundwater, a report that the department develops. But it also leaves it open if you feel that there's a problem with those basin boundaries, or if you want to change what those basin boundaries are, it allows for that. And so the regulations are in place to basically set up the process to allow people to make requests to the department to change those basin boundaries. Other things that we're working on, so we will be developing best management practices with respect to sustainable groundwater management. It's not really going to tell you how to develop a sustainability plan, but it'll talk about some of the best management practices that we've been able to come up with over the years based on our experience with working with local agencies. We're developing the regulations for these basin boundary revisions. We'll be developing regulations for the sustainability plans themselves, and so that kind of lays out what the requirements are, the required pieces in those plans, and what the department will be reviewing for that. We're required to identify basins subject to critical conditions of overdraft. We'll be updating those as part of this effort, and then ultimately we'll be evaluating those sustainability plans. So that's kind of the first area, and that's really to support local development of sustainability plans. The second one is statewide technical assistance. So the department collects lots of data. We partner with local agencies to collect lots of data with respect to groundwater, either groundwater levels, groundwater quality, stream flow, and we're trying to position ourselves to make that data available to the widest group of people to be able to evaluate that data and make use of it as you're developing your sustainability plans. So you may not know what's going on in your neighbor's basin, but if we can get that data out there, then you're able to access that information. So looking at groundwater quality, groundwater elevation data, subsidence data, making people aware of that information, and then again, we continue to implement what's called the CASGEM program, which is working with local agencies to submit their groundwater data and their groundwater elevation data in particular. So that's kind of the improving technical information. We also have improving statewide planning. So the department, in terms of our normal activities, have a number of planning activities with respect to updating what we call Bulletin 118, also updating the California Water Plan. And so we're trying to position ourselves in the data that we're developing and the data we're collecting to more effectively support these groundwater sustainability agencies. So, right now, one of the things the California Water Plan does is develop water budgets for the different areas in the state using the data that we're collecting. We want to make those water budgets actually more effective and more relevant as the local agencies are implementing their sustainability plans. And then at some point, there will be local assistance for, within Proposition 1, there's funding for groundwater storage projects, so how can we make that information available to support local recharge projects? The fourth area is to assist with aligning the state. So again, with the state and the local GSAs, this is where the financial assistance comes into play. So we do have, we're working out the details to get financial assistance for areas that want to develop, that need facilitation support. So maybe you want to do a stakeholder assessment within your basin to see what are the interests, or if you have these areas where there's kind of competing ideas about who should be the GSA, we're providing financial assistance to support that in terms of facilitation services. And these are kind of third-party people who can come in. They're expert at meeting facilitation and negotiations and discussion, and they can actually help with public outreach meetings and things like that. And so we're hoping in the next maybe 3 to 4 weeks that will actually be available, and we'll be sending out announcements about that. We are also, part of this, we're providing education and communication assistance with respect to the different requirements, and also trying to align the different activities. So what we're doing, we're trying to make sure that it makes sense with what the Water Board is doing and what the local agencies are doing. So we're kind of aligning efforts to reach that common goal of sustainable groundwater management. And then finally, the fifth area is the interregional interaction. So, the state has these projects related to identifying new surface storage, improving conditions in the delta. So we're going to continue those efforts, and ultimately we're hoping that's going to lead to better management of water across the state and looking at the interaction between basins. So that's another area we're looking at in terms of our technical assistance. Okay, so now I just want to drill down quickly into some of the near-term activities that we'll be implementing. This is kind of a laundry list, but really it comes down to basin priorities. So under the legislation, we're required to update basin priorities. That's the high, medium, low, very low priorities. We developed initial set June of last year, June of 2014, and then we essentially are using those right now as the starting point. But the legislation, the SGMA legislation, requires us to look at things like habitat and stream flow and how could that affect those basin priorities. So we will be evaluating that as we move forward. We're going to be updating the basin subject to conditions of critical overdraft. So we're hoping by the end of this year we'll have some kind of updated information on that. We'll be going through a process to define what criteria we're going to use to make those establishments, but we are working on that right now. The biggest thing right now is these basin boundary regulations, and I'll go into detail on that in a minute. Those are due January of next year, followed closely by the groundwater sustainability plan regulations, and those are due June of next year. End of 2016, the department is going to put out a report highlighting water available for replenishment. So that's looking kind of statewide, looking at the system, and we still haven't really defined how this is, what factors to consider here yet. But the idea is if there is water available to support groundwater recharge projects, we're going to try to identify that and make that information available to local agencies. And then as part of this, we'll be developing updates of our Bulletin 118, which is California's groundwater. And the importance of this is Bulletin 118 is really where we are defining things like the basin boundaries, the high, medium, low are all going to be kind of defined in this Bulletin 118. So we're coming out with an interim report in 2017 and followed by a more comprehensive report in 2020. And then, as I mentioned, we'll also be developing these best management practices for sustainable groundwater management, and those are due out January of 2017. Tony did a great job of covering the GSA, so I won't really go on much more on that. Only to say that, from our perspective, the state's perspective, we just want to make sure that the entire basin is covered one way or another. I mean, that's going to be the bottom line. There are these different options for forming GSAs, and again, ideally, you don't have 100 different plans out there for a single basin. But in the end, the most thing we're concerned about is just having basins there's a portion of the basin that's not covered because there's no one there to take over that responsibility. So that's the main thing that we're hoping to avoid as we move forward. In terms of the basin boundary regulations, we're in that process right now. Right now, I'd say we're more in the scoping phase. So some of the things we're doing at meetings like this, and we just want to hear what your issues are with respect to, why agencies or areas are looking at changing the existing basin boundaries, if that's necessary, and so we can at least learn what the concerns are. So that's kind of phase one here, is just project scoping. And then very soon now, we're actually going to be starting into the next phase, which is really drafting principles for those two sets of regulations. So what are going to be the kind of key areas of focus for the regulations? I'll talk at the end about our public listening sessions that are coming up, and also meeting with the different advisory groups. And then from there, we'll go to drafting the regulations. And that will go through the California Water Commission, and then finally by the end of this year for the basin boundary regs, we will be adopting those, or we'll be putting those through the Water Commission, and then they go to the Office of Administrative Law for kind of final submittal. And then, so it's end of this year for those basin boundary regulations, and then middle of 2016 for the groundwater sustainability plans. And this is just a timeline. I know you can't read it, but I just want to highlight what's going on here. So there's basically a number of different times where we're working through the California Water Commission. First, this month in April, we go to them with these principles I talked about for the basin boundaries, and then we'll go to them with draft regulations, and then we'll go to them with kind of, after we go through a public comment period, we'll go to them with final regulations, and ultimately at the end of the year, they'll actually approve the regulations themselves. There are a number of public comment periods in between this, and plus we're going out and having these different meetings with local agencies and our different advisory groups to get feedback as well on those draft regulations and principles. And then similar on the bottom here is the sustainability plans. It's following a similar process, only that we have an extra 6 months. So June of next year, the regulations for those will be coming out. So I do want to mention the public listening sessions. So these are coming up at the end of the month. I believe the closest one here would be the San Bernardino one. It's Thursday, April 30th. We've got it's 1 to 3 o'clock. We have the location all set up here. And again, the purpose of these public listening sessions is to hear the issues with respect to the regulations that we're developing. And primarily we're focusing on the basin boundary revisions. And so it'll be an opportunity to we'll talk about what we're doing, we'll talk about the principles at that time as well, and then be able to hear what the concerns are about moving forward. We're not, at these listening sessions, we're not showing any draft regulations because we haven't started the draft regulations yet, but it's just, again, get the feedback before we get into that drafting process to hear what the concerns are. And then also, for those who are not able to meet any of these meetings, we will have a webinar, kind of a web-based version of this listening session where it'll be all through WebEx, and you can hear from there just from your computer. In terms of the basin priorities, I kind of mentioned this already, so we are also looking at that. The legislation requires us to consider the stream flow and habitat conditions and how those might fit into the basin priorities. So in theory, we may be updating those basin priorities, and some things could change. We don't think that if you're a high basin now, all of a sudden you're going to be a low basin, or if you're a medium, you're going to be a low basin, but there may be some minor changes around some of the lower priority basins. And those, when we do finally reestablish those priorities, those will be part of the Bulletin 118 when it comes out in 2017. Also talked about identifying conditions of critical overdraft. I think I'll skip through that. Updating Bulletin 118. And then finally, what I did want to mention, this is my kind of final slide here though. If you go to this website here, it's water.ca.gov/groundwater, and you'll see a link there that says subscribe. So if you're interested in getting our notices as we're moving forward, we're having public meetings, or we come out with our draft regulations, get on this listserv and you'll get an email blast of those activities as they move forward. And there are a number of websites. So the department has a website talking about our different activities. The State Water Board has one with respect to their roles. And then the state as a whole, we have this kind of joint one that has the broad legislation on there and kind of the broad statewide activities. So that's our websites. And I think with that, that's all I had. So I'm happy to answer questions if we have time.
If I may, one question. Under local assistance, you mentioned Proposition 1, which is about $4 billion less than what was originally proposed. And much of that money is to be spent towards co-equal goals throughout the state. Realistically, what assistance might this area get from DWR to financially support any plans?
Yeah, so Proposition 1 did carve out 800, I think it was 900 million total for groundwater projects as a whole. A lot of that was really focused on groundwater remediation and cleanup projects. But it did carve out $100 million that's specifically available for groundwater management specifically. So, and the regulations and the requirements for that are still being developed. So it'll be the soonest those requirements would be out would be July of this year. But more realistically, probably the application and things like that would be out by the end of this year. But so that's $100 million spread throughout the state. But our philosophy behind that is we want to spread out as much of that $100 million throughout the state to support sustainable groundwater management as we can. So it could be for things like developing the plans, helping in the early phases. It could be things like helping formation of these groundwater sustainability agencies. It could include things like even putting in new wells if there's a need for new monitoring wells and things like that. That is all would be available. It's probably going to be, the way it's looking like, it'll be spread out over 2 to 3 years. So it's not going to be like, year one you have all this money available. Probably over 3 years, these different pots of money would be available throughout the state.
You mentioned that DWR was looking at defining basin boundaries now. Can you explain what you mean by that? Okay,
so I should clarify. So we are, it's either the basin boundaries or the basin priorities. So we actually, the basin boundaries are already in place. Those are codified in the Bulletin 118. The legislation allows a local agency to say, well, we don't like the boundaries that were defined by the department in Bulletin 118. We want want to change it. So that's what we're doing. We're developing regulations that would allow local agencies to propose basically changes to those basin boundaries as they're codified right now.
Is the latest version of the Bulletin 118 the one from 2003?
Correct. Yep. Other questions?
Anybody else? Okay.
Okay, I thought for this next item, we'd do a quick run-through on what's going on locally with the formation of GSAs and discussions and meetings and groups and that kind of thing. And it's a very short presentation. It doesn't have many slides. But the point was just to give you a flavor for what's going on locally. And if you're not participating in some of those local areas and you wish to, maybe this is your chance to become engaged on that. So let's talk about the Ojai Basin. Remember, they were one of the two that were designated in the legislation as being the exclusive GSAs in the area, so they have done an election to be the GSA. I don't know that there's been much advance beyond that. So there may be folks in the audience who know more about some of these outlying agencies than within United's territory. So if you do, please offer some updates for us. The Upper Ventura River has been charging along, it seems like. They're trying to form their JPA by January of 2016. So they're moving along, holding exploratory meetings. They're supposed to have some stakeholder meetings coming up soon. Okay? And they've even begun to talk about what their board of directors, what seats would look like on their JPA. So they're charging along and making some progress as to how they want to try to administratively organize themselves. Okay, Fox Canyon GMA has elected to be the GSA. Again, that was the second one locally that was the exclusive entity to be a GSA in their jurisdiction. In that same regard, there are other stakeholder groups that are going on that I neglected to put up there. Las Posas Basin has a users group that's very active in working on allocations and all kinds of things there. There's also recently created PTP users group, which is composed primarily of those folks who are served by United's PTP system out there. And there's also discussions of trying to expand the users group on the Oxnard Plain and be more encompassing than just the PTP users area. So there are folks talking about getting their stakeholder groups together to begin discussing the GSA and what kind of inputs and interactions they wish to have with those entities that are going to move forward as a GSA. In the Mound Basin, the City of Ventura, the County of Ventura, and United are entering into an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, to do some exploratory work on trying to form a GSA to do that. There's going to be a stakeholder meeting coming up on April 29th, 5 o'clock, over at Ventura City Hall to discuss this further and to solicit some input from stakeholders. That's in the exploratory stage. No decisions have been made. It's just an MOU that says, hey, we're all going to try to work together and figure out what's the best fit for how we move forward within the Mound groundwater basin. Within the Piru and Fillmore basins, there have been some stakeholder meetings that have taken place. Okay. They're having discussions on, do they organize as a nonprofit entity? Is there a pumpers association? Do they organize as one group, Piru and Fillmore's Pumpers Association, for example, or do they have a basin-specific group? So they're discussing that. They've heard discussions of adjudication and just trying to decide is yes, no, maybe, is this something we want to talk about, we want to think about? And possible GSA entities for those basins include the County of Ventura, United, City of Fillmore, and that kind of situation. So this is a very quick presentation. It just gives you a snapshot of what's going on out there, and to make it very clear that with the exception of the exclusive agencies, there have been no decisions made as to who would be the GSA and what the composition would be. There are discussions ongoing about that, of course, but final decisions have not been made. Okay. Questions on this? This is a very short item for today's agenda. Directors? Anything?
Any directors?
This last item here today is discussion points. It's a somewhat random collection of things that have come up in conversations that are appropriate for United's board, as well as stakeholders here today, to begin to think about how we want to handle some of these issues and situations. And so let's just jump into these. And what time is it? 10 after? Okay, we're good on time. Okay. So we've got the GMA identified as a GSA for areas within its boundary. But if you look at a map of the GMA's territory and overlay the basin boundaries, something like that, you'll see that there are these little outliers of basins. So the red is the GMA's boundary, for example, right there, and the blue is the basin boundary. So we have these little slivers and pieces of basins that don't fall totally within the GMA's jurisdiction now. And so the question is, what do we do with these? I mean, we certainly, from my perspective, don't want to have a GSA that covers this little sliver of the basin. That just doesn't make sense to me. So if that's not within their boundaries, then how do we handle that? Is there an administrative way? Can we go to Sacramento and say, hey, we need a mechanism to adjust their district boundary to match the basin boundary, or just declare that all the parties agree that this little sliver of basin can be pulled into the GMA's boundary and they're going to be the GSA for it, that makes the most sense? We need to get a way figured out to cover these little pieces that hang out. And what are we going to do with those in some way? Okay? So it's not that we have to make a decision on this, because none of us in the room have the authority to do anything about this. But these are questions that are going to have to be resolved. Okay? Let's go back for a second.
Tony, let me
Yes.
emphasize that last statement. The way this is agendized on the special board meeting, this is purely an informational item for the board. We're not in a position to make any motion. We can't take any vote. We got to be very careful that we stay away from making some declarative statements. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. We can't do that as a board. So if you have questions out there that says, what are you going to do as a board on this issue? I want to refer back to the fact that it's agendized as an informational item, and under the Brown Act, we're not going to go to those kind of decisions. We can't from a legal standpoint, so we're not going to do that. So you can carry on, but I want people to understand what our limitations are today.
Yeah, and the whole idea for titling the slide as discussion points, it's discussion points for the board, things they need to think about as we move forward down the path towards figuring out the GSA situation there. So the last set of bullets there talks about there's no GSA yet identified for the other basins, and we've already kind of covered that. We covered that slide. Okay. We also have some areas. Well, this is sort of the corollary to this. Some of the areas that fall into the slivers fall under United's boundaries as well. So is there an administrative way? It's some relief we can ask for from Sacramento to give us something in the tweaks and adjustments to the language that they're doing right now to allow us to administratively move those little slivers into the main basin with everybody's concurrence that that's the appropriate way and the most logical way to handle that. Okay, here's one that's kind of interesting. How would United continue with the surface and groundwater conjunctive use efforts within the Fox Canyon GSA area? As the folks in this room are well aware, United has significant infrastructure that support sustainability activities within the GMA's boundaries. With the GSA now being in the Fox Canyon camp, how do these agencies work together? in the future? Administratively? Financially? How do they work together? Okay. Is there some sort of formal relationship that has to be there because significant effort is going to be expended there in an area that isn't within United's, it's in United's territory, but the GSA is the lead agency responsible for getting us to sustainability in that area? How do we put those pieces together? And these are the things that the Act doesn't give you any guidance on. It goes back to that early comment I made. They said, oh, you want to do it? All right, here's the baton, do it. Figure it out. Well, we also have to make sure that we're consistent with what the Act has in there and how we might go about doing that. So is there a way for, or even a need, that we have some sort of an agreement between entities on how we operate in the future? And if we're not going to do it that way, then how would United's historical role be performed? What would we do? If we're not going to continue to work that way, the other side of the coin is, then what would we do? Okay, then what would we do? Okay. What's the role of United outside of the Fox Canyon GSA? So that's, for all intents and purposes, that's the Mound, Fillmore, Piru, and a portion of the West Las Posas basins. Should United consider being a GSA for those territories within its current boundary? Or do you want to do that? It's a question we have to discuss and figure out which is the path forward. Yes? No? Maybe? Okay. Once again, we have those little sliver ideas. We have a little piece of the Mound Basin that sticks out beyond our district boundary right there. We've got a little nub on the end of the Piru Basin that sticks out beyond United's boundary there and actually falls in the service area of Castaic Lake Water Agency. So how do we dot all the I's and cross all the T's to make sure we've got those kinds of administrative things taken care of? Okay. What are some of the next steps for the district? And these are posed as questions. Do you elect to be a GSA for those basins totally or partially within your boundaries? Is that what we want to do? If we want to do that, okay, then the clock starts. We've got so much time to get our groundwater sustainability plan. We got to figure out what the administrative and the governance structure is going to look like. If we're a GSA, are there others that will want to be GSAs as well within those basins? Those conversations have already started in the Mound Basin, for example. But I have a sneaking suspicion that those discussions will continue on in the other basins within United's boundaries as well. Okay. Whenever we talk about the GSA and we have an organization that's there, one of the things that comes to my mind is that there are going to be other players involved. There's going to be cities or irrigation districts or environmental organizations or whatever that are going to have an impact on us getting to our sustainability goals. And so is it the role of the GSA to tell those entities how to operate? I'm not so sure that's the path forward. Okay, cities are doing what cities need to do. The irrigation community is doing what it needs to do. The environmental folks are doing what they need to do. Okay. Is it that the GSA is then going to be some sort of overarching kind of organization that basically says, okay, we've got to get to this point by this date and that point by that date, and here's our plan to do it. Now, who of you can contribute to getting us to that plan? And then your role within their environmental organization is X and Y. And cities, you're going to do A, B, and C. And other districts are going to do X and Y. Okay? And maybe that's the way it goes forward. What that means is every one of those folks or entities that sign up to do that, everybody else within the GSA is relying on you to do your part. So it's going to be sustainability is achieved, but only if everybody does what they agree to do in the sustainability plan to get us to the goal. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. So anyway, that's all I wanted to present, I think, today on this. It was just food for thought for our directors and for staff.
Yeah, Tony, before you leave, let me open up, it is an informational item. You have 6 of the 7 members of the board of United here, and I think the board wants to hear from you folks. Obviously, a lot of information for us, for you, for everybody, but there is activity going on within the county to move this issue down the road. At the GMA, as I think a number of you know, I'm United's representative to the GMA and serve currently as its chairman of the GMA, Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency. And we are moving down the road of trying to solve the problem at the Fox Canyon and work our way through some of the issues. Some of the staff members from GMA are here. Up in the Fillmore-Piru area, United overlies that area. I'd like to hear from you. Ed, I'll let you kind of lead the discussion.
Yeah, by looking around the room, I see that most of the people here are my friends and neighbors and fellow pumpers in the Fillmore and Piru basins. To me, United seems like the natural agency to form the GSA for us. But I really want to hear what everybody has, what your opinions are, what you have to say. Now's the time. So, do we have a microphone? Margie?
Yeah, Ed, I appreciate that, but in his options that he just put up there for Fillmore, he listed the county, UWCD, and the city of Fillmore. What about us in Bardsdale and Piru, who are ag people who are pumping water? We need some kind of say in that. We just can't turn this over to these other entities that don't have our interests at heart.
Well, I'll make one comment. You are represented on the United board by me, so, and I'm your neighbor, so hopefully I'll look after us.
But you made it very clear that you are supporting UWCD as the lead part of this deal for Fillmore, Piru, Bardsdale, that area. And that may not be what the rest of us in those areas hope for.
Sorry, Margie, I'm trying to look around Barb to see you here. Okay, well, it's time for everybody
For
to...
myself, I don't know what the rest of the growers think, but that's my opinion on that. We need some
Thanks, Barb.
representation for ourselves.
Okay, any other comments, questions? Jim?
Hold on, we get the microphone. Ed, I would concur with you. I think United is probably the most logical to start it, but it's my understanding that United, I mean, in this, you're going to have however big the board is that will be made up of pumpers from different locations, cities, environmental groups, and that. And as sitting as president of Sespe Water Company, which is probably one of the larger mutuals in the Fillmore Basin, I would expect that you'd have representation from the various areas within the basin and the entities. So, but with that, then United is the logical lead.
Thanks, Jim.
I'm in the Piru area, and I'm going right along with Ed as being our representative. He is an elected representative, and United Water is the most logical group. They have very proficient personnel that can cover all of this, and I really don't think that all these outlying individuals such as myself have the abilities that the United Water Group has as our agency, and I would hopefully that they along with being Ed as our elected representative would continue. Thank you.
Just a side comment there. You've got to give Tony here some credit for giving us the presentation. If you want to talk water, talk to the United staff. It's pretty amazing the resources that we have there on staff. Okay, Pete?
I'm involved in the Fillmore Basin, mainly as representatives of mutual water companies. And I agree, we couldn't have a better representative than Ed on United's board, and I kind of agree with what's been said, but there's part of me that says the mutual water companies and the individual pumpers within the Fillmore Basin ought to be part of the group that the GSA. They ought to be the GSA. That's just kind of my feelings.
Well, I'm not sure how you'd work that out, but we certainly need a voice.
Well, it could be a nonprofit organization, nonprofit mutual benefits, similar to the Santa Paula Basin Pumpers Association.
Sorry, Pete, got to get the mic.
It could be similar to a nonprofit mutual benefit association, similar to the Santa Paula Basin Pumpers, or I think possibly it could be some type of joint powers agreement or MOU, what Tony mentioned, these legal organizations, but to have a voice from the individual pumpers and especially the mutual water companies, because you've got a large group of people associated with a mutual water company that might not have their own individual water well. But to me, those are the voices that ought to be the makeup of the GSA.
Question for Tony, Mike, staff. Legally, can that be done?
Well, it's
I'm gonna
it's
have to
my
defer, Pete, I
understanding
don't know.
today that mutuals cannot be on the GSA.
Now, you mean to be on a GSA or to be a GSA?
To be a GSA.
Okay.
That's my understanding. There is legislation circulating in Sacramento to change that, to get mutuals and for-profit water companies and a few others to have that ability to making the election to be a GSA, but I don't think those have, they certainly haven't been finalized yet. Where's Russ is in the room? I see you under the light there.
I was going to
Let's
continue
get the
on.
microphone to Russ, and then back to Barb. First, Mike.
Yeah, Tony's answered the question. The mutual can't be a GSA, and I'm sure Russ is going to weigh in on the legal part, but my understanding too, or our understanding is, if, let's say, United took the action to become GSA, and there was another group that created like a Fillmore Pumpers Association, our board could then decide, you will sign an MOU, and you're part of now a two-party decision process to make a decision. That means, though, then if you do that, you have to reach a consensus, or they now have a vote. And obviously, the more you add to that, the more difficult the decision becomes.
So the lead agency would be United, unless some sort of an MOU is formed with someone else.
Decided and okay that a group to join in.
Okay. Barb, do you mind if I have Russ chime in on that? Russ, maybe introduce yourself, and then we'll go back to Barb Filkins. Sorry, Bob.
Yes, hi, I'm Russ McLaughlin, and I'm an attorney with Brownstein Hyatt, Farber Schreck, and know many people in the room. I'm not here to provide any legal advice, but I will in my own state, in my own research of the act and participating and drafting it. There are opportunities for joint powers authorities and MOUs that if there is agreement amongst the local agencies, with the local agencies, can participate in governance. And I'm not going to go into the details. I can explore that separately with folks. But just to say it in a practical application, if there's the will for broad-based governance and joint collaborative governance, there is the legal capacity to do so, and I can explain that separately with anyone.
Thanks, Russ.
And I think the County of Ventura, the supervisors have indicated a preference that they would be involved with GSA activities in the basins. Tully, did I overstate that? No? Okay.
Thanks for your
Okay.
patience, Barb.
That's okay. As one of the mutuals in this basin, as president of Fillmore Irrigation, of the three options that have been placed up there, I think that probably the lead agency most flexible and most in alignment with representing our needs as a mutual would be United. But having said that, I also have a pretty strong, and I think a lot of the people in this room either are adjoining mutuals or they have representation as shareholders in our mutual. That I do think that there needs to be a voice for the individual pumpers in this area, especially as we start to see the conflict that may go on in water usage with the city of Fillmore and with the environmental. Not trying to put either of those down, but since we serve both domestic and irrigation users, and since we also abut the Sespe Creek, I kind of am familiar with all of the above as president. So I think that we could start with United Water, but I would be very interested in what the way of getting representation for the pumpers in this basin and making sure that they're well represented and part of the governance process would be.
If I could
Thanks, Mark.
offer,
Good points.
If I could offer a point of clarification, the list that was up there were just example entities that could do it. It could be 1, 2, or all of the above that elect to be a GSA. And if they all elected to be a GSA, then you have to decide how are you going to work together to get to the goals. So.
I think that's, and I agree with that. It's going to be a governance process.
Yep.
And you may be a JPA, I don't know.
Yep. Something like that may be appropriate.
But I was just reacting to the point, but there's probably a broader discussion that needs to go on.
Fair enough.
I have a comment, something to think about anyway. It's my understanding that the GSA has the right to create its own fees, which involve money. And as ratepayers to United, you're already paying fees to United. But if there are other participants, let's say besides United as the lead agency, what is the financial obligation of those other participants to participate in the decisions, actively support the financing of those decisions? And I think that is where some thought needs to be given. If there are mutuals or even environmentals or other governmental entities, what are they going to put into the organization as well if they are part of the decision-making body?
Hopefully and this is, I'm not at all saying this is the plan, but one of the things we have been discussing at staff level, we've mentioned to the board that one way for that governance process to work would be if United was the GSA and let's say the county too. We had an AB 3030 group before a council, something very similar to that where it's an advisory board that provides the information to make sure that all the interest of the pumpers and individuals are being strongly heard by this board, and then the board would then weigh in as far as building those into the groundwater sustainability plan. But some kind of a strong advisory board that, like a neighborhood council or something that goes to a city council and says, you're missing the point here or something to make sure we don't miss anything. That's one of the things we've been trying to talk about. Not so much adding like an 8th board member, but more a strong advisory role process.
I think, Mike, that idea makes sense to me. We'd have to be sure that we got probably better representation on something like that than we had on the AB 3030 board. Yes. Katie?
Hi, I'm one of the members of one of those small mutuals, and we don't have our own well. So when Pete was talking about those entities, that's me. And I would say, I would concur with Barb and with what Pete was saying, which is the mutuals need to be represented, and I think they need to have a vote. I don't think just having an advisory position would be enough. You're asking for our input, and that would be mine.
Okay, we have.
I think.
Excuse me, Chairman wants to speak.
For whatever it's worth, I've been on the United board now coming up on 29 years. Shelley, I think, is at 30. And I've been at the GMA for a long time as well. And I don't profess to have all the answers. I readily admit that, and I'm not going to tell you that United and the GMA have solved all the problems of the universe. We have not. This is a very complex issue. It's emotional, it's financial, it's political, it is a way of life kind of issue. I will tell you, however, that my experience is it is easy to say that every entity has a vote on a board, and I will guarantee you, nothing will get done. And that's part of the problem we have today, is that we have all kinds of mechanisms to kick the can down the road, and we've done it at the state level, we've done it at the national level, we've done it at the county level. So my comment to you is that if you say, for example, I obviously come from a farming background. That's my family's heritage. But I've worked very hard at my time at United and the GMA to wear all kinds of hats, because that's what you have to do to make a valid decision, because it affects everybody across the spectrum. And I think one of the reasons that United has been very successful over the years is we've got city folks, we've got farming folks, we've got a whole variety of individuals that have sat on the United board, and not once has somebody stood up and said, I'm here to protect the cities, I'm here to protect. We have to be bigger than that. And my message to all of us is, we are in a new adventure going down the road. And that venture is that the aquifer in this community has to be brought in balance for the benefit of everybody. And just because you have a vote, because you're in a special category, if you come to the table and your only agenda is that particular item, we are all collectively doomed. And so I really would caution people about trying to engineer and game the system up front, because in gaming the system up front, you get garbage going out the back end. And the problem is bigger than any one of us individually. It's a collective problem. And that's really one of the reasons I think it's important to have this meeting. It's important because it is easy for United to say, yeah, we got the technical expertise, yep, we've been doing this before, just sit back and relax. And that's not what you want. We accept, I think, at least I accept, if we wind up at United being a lead agency, this is a huge responsibility for United, because it affects all of your lives, and all of us in this room come from totally different backgrounds. And how do you balance that out? So be careful about trying to game the system up front, because in my experience at the GMA, which I've been at, as I said, for a long time, at United for a long time, I've watched a lot of boards game the system by selected folks on those boards, and school districts fail. We have tons of examples in other areas, and I don't want this to fail us. I don't want it to fail you. So just a word of caution. That's my message right now. Be careful about gaming the system up front, because it may not solve the problem down the road.
I think you have, the saying on the street now is the water is the new oil. I think we're facing that. We can't game the system, but I think having a balanced representation across the community is important. And so I know, and I hate to hit you guys with this, but every time the fees come around for United Water, there's always the question of, why are we paying them? What are we getting for our money? I hate to bring that up. But having the main agencies in this region represented as part of a lead agency is super. I also think we need to be able to bring in the mutuals that cover both the domestic and the irrigation throughout the region. And that's going to be harder than, I'm sitting here and saying it's going to be harder to do than to say it, because everybody has their own little agenda, so it kind of becomes a microcosm of the bigger picture. But I think it needs representation. How we go about it, I don't know. An advisory board can be very powerful, and it can be very weak. It depends on how it's treated and how it feeds into the voting membership of the board. Putting an 8th seat on the board brings you to an even number, and nobody can break a tie. So boards should always have some odd number. So I understand what you're saying, Lynn. I think the governance is going to be a fairly significant piece of this, and there needs to be enough checks and balances as it's put together that nobody can really game it. And that's going to be really hard.
Barb, I could visualize an advisory board that would contain key interested players, the people that are here that are talking, the people who have been talking for a while, which could be a significant influence on this board. So I don't know how we put it together exactly, but if we have the right people, then I think it could work. And, okay, Mike, and then I think Richard Sweet over here had a comment earlier, but I skipped him. Go ahead, Mike.
So my opinion is that we have elected you as United Water to represent us across the county. And so my opinion is your vote should be the final vote. I think that the AB 3030 concept or advisory concept is key. It might be one representative from each mutual, including a representative from the county and from whatever other agencies need to be on that advisory board. It might be a board of, hopefully it's not a huge board, but it might be a board of 10 or 12 people. And the objective of that and the mission, obviously, is to be the voice for all of the water companies and the county, feedback, giving you our opinion and our feedback, and then obviously, in my opinion, the decision would be yours, but you make your decision based on our discussion collectively, you're as a board and the advisory as a collective communication, and that's how the decision should be made, in my opinion.
Good idea. It sounds like you're volunteering for a future
committee seat.
Too.
Yeah.
Richard Sweet, Ventura. I'd like to say that I've been observing United for several years, and I have observed that staff has done an excellent job. You have great capability. And I think one thing that needs to change is to have greater separation between the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency and United. I think that United should focus on its mission to address the waters of Santa Clara and to get away from having the Oxnard Plain dominate what United's focus is.
Lynn, I wonder correct me if I'm wrong, but United looks after all of the groundwater basins in the county.
Yeah, I agree. Let me just make a quick comment on that. If you actually look at the total geography within United's boundaries, obviously the bulk of it is in the Oxnard Plain. I think a bigger issue, and it's a result of the litigation that's gone on between United and Ventura at the trial court and at the appellate court. Both the trial court and the appellate court ruled that United's understanding of the interconnect of the aquifers throughout its boundaries is in fact the correct understanding of those aquifers. Now, what's that mean? That means that what goes on in your area has effect on the next area, has effect on the next area, all the way down. And it also means that the Oxnard Plain can't suck all the water dry and expect all of it to come to you. So I would disagree with you, Richard, that it is important for United and the GMA to actually work together because the boundaries don't overlap. And the appellate court has ruled, the trial court ruled, and the appellate court upheld the rule that, in fact, there is a massive interconnect of different variations and different degrees, and all of that is going to play into the sustainability process. And I understand the need for folks in an area to say we have a series of mutuals and we need to protect our rights in the mutual. I get all of that. But there is a bigger world, because if we don't operate under the way the trial court and the appellate court have ruled, it has the potential to change the whole dynamic of how we fund and operate our whole community. And so there are all kinds of factors that are going on that are bigger than any one little basin because all the basins have some interconnect to it. And United, and working directly with the GMA, has the capacity to do that. When the GMA was formed, United was one of the permanent seats to the GMA. And I don't sense right now that the GMA is going to change its structure. So there are two full seats at the GMA board. One is the county and one is United, and we have fulfilled that role and we'll continue to do that. So I think we need to have a bigger perspective of how this county and the water flows in this county, and that's one of the things that United has spent over the years by upgrading the quality of its groundwater department, and you're seeing it today with Tony and other staff members that are here that help support him in that work. So.
I'm representing myself and also another mutual water company. Some of us maybe remember over 60 years ago that our wells went dry, and people in this area said, well, we don't know whether we want to build a dam up at Piru or not because that's starting to take all our water. Well, we went ahead with it, and I think it's worked well. And I think with this meeting, it's great that we can work together and have good representation and solve the problem.
Thanks, Bob. Let's see, Katie?
Could you, we saw up there that you have proposals that have already, people who have put their names forward as the GSA in other areas, so the Upper Ventura area?
Yes.
And listed in there as well, if I'm remembering properly, was the city and the county?
Correct.
Is that right? So, along with United?
No. We don't cover Upper Ventura
Okay.
River.
But wasn't there another area where you were going to be? Mound. Okay, so you're going to be in there with, United's going to be in there working with both the city
And the
city
county.
there
And the
the
county.
county?
Yes.
So,
Again, that just emphasizes. Those are three entities, agencies that are recognized within the Sustainability Act that have the authority to be part of a GSA. We have a question mark whether mutuals have that capacity
Right.
and whether they change the law. I don't know.
so within there, how are you going to organize yourself? You're going to have, how many seats will they have? How many votes will they have?
don't know.
You don't know yet?
We're working on that right now.
We don't know.
We just signed an MOU, or about to, I haven't signed it yet, but
Here.
We've just had some preliminary meetings, signed an MOU to say, how are we going to work on exactly what you're saying? How are we going to form ourselves so that we create a GSA that can make decisions and do things? So we're in the preliminary stages of that also, right now.
we'll work our way through it.
Okay, any other questions or comments about the Fillmore Piru GSA, anything else that's been discussed? I see a lot of neighbors here who I know are going to jump on me as soon as the meeting's over, so go ahead and say what you want to say. It's okay. Okay. Back to Lynn.
Let me just echo what Ed just said. This is a process, and the first element of the process is to educate, and hopefully we did some of that. I know the wheels are spinning, and you're going to walk out of the door and go, darn, I should have said this, or I should have said that. Emails, letters, phone calls to your representative, to staff members. This is a process. I don't know what the perfect answer is, but I think what the board is willing to do is work its way through a process that works for all of us. There's some caveats along the way. Be careful what you wish for. It's not as easy as you think. There's a lot of interconnection going on and a lot of responsibility going on, but let's have that dialogue. And I think that Tony and staff, and I thank Rich for coming down, I think they've done a wonderful job today. I'm hopefully that it was a beneficial day to you. It was to me, and I think to the board. This is not the end of the process. It's the beginning of the process. And I look to Ed and Mike, who represent this side of the district's boundary, to give us leadership on where we go. So if you have questions, there's where the questions go. Call any of us. send emails to Mike and flood him with emails. That's what I say to you. So, all right, anybody have any questions or anything else before we, yes, here.
What are the mechanics of
Hold on, I got to get you on the mic. There you go.
What are the mechanics of appointing a GSA? Are we electing from a ballot? How are we going to do that?
Okay, it's pretty.
It's a staff function.
It's pretty simple. The board makes a motion and says, all those in favor of being a GSA, raise their hand.
You have to have a public
Now,
hearing.
We have to have a
there's a
public hearing.
public stakeholder outreach program before that. If they want to consider that, they go out and talk to the stakeholders and get their opinion. Yes, no, maybe we like the idea, we don't like the idea, we like it with caveats, whatever the situation is. But the actual election to be a GSA is a board level function. They make the decision that they wish to accept that baton.
Isn't there,
Up to the,
you talk about it. You know the answer.
Let me back up with that. That doesn't mean they're the only GSA, right, for a basin. The county could do the same thing. A city in that basin could do the same thing. Then once there are 3 entities, let's say, or more than one entity, then they've got to figure out how they're going to work together.
Well, by January 1st, 2017, somebody has to say they're a GSA, or the state or the county becomes the GSA. That's part of this process here. We're talking, we're going to hopefully get some direction from the board. At some point, we want to know, when do they want us to set up a public hearing to decide whether to be a GSA or not? Once any agency, if say the city of Fillmore had a public hearing next week and said they wanted to be the GSA, then United would have to act in the next 90 days to make that determination. Once one agency does it, any other agency interested has to act within 90 days, or that one agency is the only GSA. So that's why we want to make sure once we do it, we're ready, because then the clock starts. So, but it is not a voter option.
There's a question.
Does the board have any intention today, I understand there's a meeting after this, to pass a motion to decide to become a GSA?
There's no meeting today, other than...
It's not on the agenda.
No, our general board meeting is next Wednesday. It is not agendized. At this point, our board has not given us direction to set up, notice any kind of public hearing for that. At the appropriate time, they tell us, obviously, we have to notify, we'll put it in the paper, do all the public noticing, and you'll also get mailings like you did today that we're going to have that such meeting if it's decided.
I've got one more thing, Lynn. Does the city of Fillmore is here? Do you want to weigh in or make any comments?
Hello, Mike LeBrake, city engineer, city of Fillmore. The city of Fillmore does not have the financial resources or the administrative resources to become a GSA, and we're looking to United to take the leadership role in this, and we support you.
Thank you very much. Okay, last chance before I hand the microphone back to Lynn, and he doesn't give it up easy.
There is a quiz. It's only 10 questions. You got Tony, anything else you want to cover?
I think that's it for today.
Okay, let me, following procedural protocol, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn this meeting to the regular board meeting of Wednesday, April 8th in Santa Paula, and this item that we discussed today is not on the agenda, so the earliest would be on the following month if we decide to move forward. Okay? Anything else? Going once? Going twice? Thank you very much.